We have Lily Tsai here with us today. She's a professor of political science at MIT with more than 25 years of research and fieldwork, primarily in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. And she's the founder of MIT's Governance Lab, which is a group of political scientists who develop and test innovations in citizen engagement and government responsiveness. Welcome, Lily. And we have Santiago Levy, who is the non-resident senior fellow at Global Economy and Development Program in the at Brookings. He's a development economist with broad experience, so over 40 years, including leadership positions at the Inter-American Development Bank and, of course, the Ministry of Finance in Mexico. And he was the architect of Progresa Oportunidades, which is an incentive-based health, nutrition, and education program for the poor, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Welcome, Santiago. So let's jump right in, and I'll start with you, Lily. People often assume that citizen engagement always leads to better, more accountable government. What does the evidence tell us?
The easy question. I mean, I think that is a common assumption or hope. We want what citizens say to matter. We want democratic representation and participation to matter. You know, but of course, as we all know, as researchers and evaluators, that evidence is always mixed. I mean, I think the first thing maybe to point out is that there are really two types of citizen engagement, or two reasons that we want citizen engagement. One is, of course, to improve governance and development, but the second one is also to limit the abuse of power. And so I think it's worth highlighting that even though most of what I'm going to talk about is based on the evidence for the first, the linkage between citizen engagement and governance and development, we sometimes just want citizen engagement just because we want to prevent really bad things from happening. So the first thing that's been really clear to me as I looked over the evidence base is that 20 years ago, when I started working on these issues, there was very little evidence. There were very few evaluations. It wasn't a core part of the bank's work. And I think over the last 20 years, it's been extraordinary how much research and how much evaluation there has been done. So that's an enormous strength in our field. I think that, as always, 20 years actually, it takes a long time to build up a solid evidence base. And so the evidence continues to be pretty thin and mixed. And so in my comments, I'm going to highlight three things about at least the academic evidence base, which is what I know best. The first one is alignment, the importance of alignment. The second one is the importance of context, which we all talk about. And the third is actually a point about how best to learn from the evidence, which is that we need to build more houses and not just be making bricks or individual studies. So, first, I'm going to be speaking in broad, sweeping generalizations. We can always, of course, find cases of everything. But broadly speaking, the first thing I would say is that the evidence for citizen engagement improving government accountability and development is strongest when we have alignment between the kind of input citizens are asked to give and governments that are willing and able to respond to them. So that is very clear situations like citizens are asked if there's a pothole on their road, the government wants to fill in the pothole, citizens call, and the government's like, great, we know where the pothole is now, right? Or we have 5% of the budget allocated to a participatory budgeting process. Citizens, tell us what your top 3 priorities are. We want to spend that 5% of the budget on what you say, right? So those are situations where there's clear evidence that citizen engagement leads to accountable government and better development. Now, the problem is that most of us do not work in contexts where the problem and the solution are so simple. And so, yes, there's more evidence for the short route to accountability, as Manny was saying, less evidence for the long route to accountability outside rich democracies, because it's easier to get that alignment with the short route. It's also easier to get that alignment when there are clear mechanisms for sanctioning poor performers. So over and over again, we see studies where, you might get citizens to take action, you might get citizens to monitor, but there is not government accountability or better development when there is not a clear sanctioning mechanism. So in cases where there are clear top-down sanctioning mechanisms, where higher levels are clearly willing and visibly, they can make a credible commitment, they show visible punishment of poor performers, then you get citizen engagement that leads to better development. Or when you provide citizens with sanctioning mechanisms. There's an interesting example in Rwanda, of all places, where government officials are required to disclose assets. What the government does is they make non-compliers public, and they make their places of work public, so then citizens can also socially sanction poorly performing officials. So those are examples where there are clear sanctioning mechanisms, and that is what enables citizen engagement to lead to accountable government. When we look at the database, and MIT GovLab has just completed an evidence review with TAI, Transparency Accountability Initiative, that's coming out shortly. We see that 2/3 of the studies, and these are all experimental or quasi-experimental studies, 2/3 of the studies at least published, so this is subject to the usual caveats about publication bias, et cetera. And I'll look forward to hearing what all of you are also finding, because I think that you guys are looking at actually different evidence bases than I am. But based on our reading of the academic evidence, it is true that most studies, 2/3, show that citizen engagement lead to better development outcomes and better public service provision. But, and now here, I think is a really important point about context. Most of the studies come from 2 countries, Uganda and Indonesia, right? And so what we can basically say is that in Uganda and Indonesia, it is likely that citizen engagement will lead to better governance and development. And now, of course, that leads to an important question about context. What is it about those contexts that makes citizen engagement more likely to lead to accountable government? Now, a couple of things, a couple of just observations that we might make. These are countries where they were willing to have these interventions. So there was clearly political will at some level. There was clearly a willingness to sanction performers at some level. And moreover, academics were willing to do studies in these countries. So there must have been, some higher probability of getting a positive, significant effect. But the broader comment is simply that context matters. And so that leads me to my third point. We need to take this opportunity as we accumulate these growing evidence bases to build houses and not just really solid bricks. So the big progress that has happened, at least in the domain where I work, is that the evidence has gotten really, really rigorous. And so we have been making really solid bricks. But what we have now is this big field where a bunch of bricks are scattered across an open field. And at best, we have little piles of bricks in Uganda and Indonesia. But very few people are building houses. And I think that's where 3IE, the systematic reviews that, again, MIT GovLab has worked on TAI on this evidence synthesis that allows, and we've built actually a prototype tool to enable people to look at evidence in the context that is most relevant to where you're working. And this is a really important thing, because this allows you to pick out, like right now, since there are no houses, this allows you to identify the brick that you should be looking at first. And that I think is the problem. Like, we have lots of evidence. We don't know how to use it. It's not organized. And so we need to do more work along those lines. And so this prototype tool, what this does is it identifies the contextual characteristics, like, do you work in a context where there are clear sanctioning mechanisms, top-down sanctioning mechanisms? Do you work in a context where there's an organized civil society that can provide that bottom-up pressure? It lists out the different kinds of contextual characteristics that are important for a particular question. Whether you're holding bureaucrats and frontline service providers accountable, or whether you're holding politicians accountable, different contextual characteristics come into play. These would be the control variables in a regression. And so this interactive tool allows you to punch in what is the question you're interested in, what is the country context you're working in, and then it spits out the studies and evaluations that are most relevant to your context. And that, I would argue, is what we need to be doing more of.
Thank you. Wow, that was great. I already have a new thought about building an evidence house out of the pile of evidence bricks. And is this tool something that's publicly available?
Yes, we're going to put it online shortly.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And then we can also promote it to the conference participants. That's great. But that raises a question that we wanted to ask you, because over the past 10, 20 years, there has been a lot of evidence starting to be generated, but Are average citizens able to use this evidence to engage in policy discussions? And if not, why not?
So good morning, and thank you for having me here, particularly David DeFerranti. Thanks for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. So as I was thinking about this panel this morning, on the one hand, on the sort of the positive side, it is really very important that we're discussing issues about accountability and engagement now, because we're pushing the issues one step further. If we think about 20 years ago, there's a huge amount of discussion about what works and what doesn't work. And really the accomplishments of development economics over the last 20 years in terms of, not always, but broadly knowing what works under particular conditions and what doesn't work, we're much better today than we were 20 years ago. I think the challenge is now, how does that knowledge get communicated to policymakers? We have come with a simplified view in our heads that there's a problem out there in some country, in Senegal, in Costa Rica, or in Vietnam, wherever. The research is done, evidence is accumulated, and then there's a dialogue between the people who produce research and produce the evidence, and somebody called a policymaker. The dialogue occurs, and then the policymaker converts that knowledge and that evidence into policy, and then their results. And that's kind of the production function that we have, from evidence to policy dialogue to results. And I think that production function is a little bit too simplified, too naive, and it presumes that there's a policymaker in the middle that is willing to absorb the evidence that is produced, which presumes that the evidence is credible and presumes that the evidence is understandable. And that it's put in language such that not only the policymaker but a broad set of people can use it. And this is where I think the challenge is today. We have generated a huge amount of evidence. That evidence is broad surely within the development community, but my subjective perception would be that we're not at the point in which we're able to communicate that broadly shared knowledge within a small group in the end, which is the development community of the international financial institutions, plus 3 or 4 ministries in each government, plus 1 or 2 universities in each country, to the broader public. And that is what I think is needed if we really want to get genuine and sustained engagement by citizens. Citizens need to understand how they can be engaged in these discussions. And I've done a lot of work on Latin America. That's the region that I know best in the world. And even today, even though there are a lot of evaluations that we know about many topics, it's more the exception than the rule that the policy debate is influenced by this evidence. Mm-hmm. Take a very important issue in Latin America, the quality of education. We know a lot about what works to improve the quality of education, whether you give subsidies to the teachers or you don't, or you give subsidies to the children, or you use computers or whatever. The amount of that knowledge that is actually being used in the Paraguayan Congress as they debate Paraguay's education law is very little. And I could say the same for almost any Congress, including my own country, the Mexican. They're reforming now the education. And the evidence that is out there, that has been produced over the last 20 years of research, is not really being used in a way. So
do you have
the challenge
any
is
ideas?
how to communicate.
Yeah, how do we get that evidence used?
So I think
there
there are two, I think we have to now, this production function that I was talking about before, we need to enrich it. We need to take it one more further, which is, we've got to be able as a development community to communicate the results of evaluations to a much broader public than what we typically think about the development community. And there's an issue of language. You know, if we tell them that the intendment to treat effect was, 95%, you're done, right? So we have to find the right language. And to be honest, we have to also have the right credibility. Because that we have the credibility with people that sit around this room doesn't mean that in many other instances, these people, including ourselves, have credibility. So building up the credibility, finding the language, and finding the means to communicate this is, I think, the next challenge. And that is what I think is really needed if we want citizens to be engaged in a deeper sense, not only of making governments accountable in the sense, don't steal the money, but making governments accountable in the sense like, look, If you are designing a new education program, you should use the evidence and not reinvent the wheel, and you should really not start from scratch. You should try to use and make you accountable because you're using my tax dollars for something in which you're wasting. We're not there yet. A lot of work in the last 20 years, but I think this is sort of a challenge as to where we need to go.
Great, that's helpful. I just want to follow up with one more thing because, you know, getting to the right people, communicating in language that they understand, all of that sounds great unless there's some other motivation to resist, for example, reform. So I want to just follow up and ask about, you know, you promoted many government reforms in Mexico. What is it that motivates governments to reform, and what is it that sometimes motivates them to resist?
So that's really complex, but there are two dimensions that one probably wants to think about here. One is any meaningful reform will have a complex political economy. There'll be gainers and losers, and there'll be some people who resist. Maybe there's some rent seekers out there that are going to be affected by the reform. And communicating to the general public that in fact such a reform is being resisted on the fact that these people are defending this rent can be a very useful part of the process of reform if that information can be credibly communicated to the public. Okay. But that requires credibility. That requires that the people that are communicating are believed by general public, so they can go to a radio show or a television show or to a newspaper interview to whatever and say, look, you know, the reason the teachers don't want to do this is because they don't want to bring down absenteeism. Or the reason they're rejecting the health reform is because whatever. The people who sell drugs are doing this or that. So there's a political economy dimension. And then there's a legitimate dimension in which there's sometimes not an obvious agreement as to what is the right policy. Right. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the evidence is insufficient to really call the shots, and people have legitimate different views. It's not that they're defending rents or that they're defending, you know, the position of firms or unions or whatever. It's just people have different views. And there what you would like to have is as broad a policy debate as you could, and then pull it from there. Perhaps the biggest example that we're all facing today is Brexit, right? This is an issue in which there's a lot of information, and there are genuine differences of opinion, and you need to work it out and debate it. That's a more complex issue. But separating the two helps a lot, particularly if you can call the shots of the people that are looking around, and evidence of the sort of stuff that Lily was talking about, and the kind of portals and the kind of information can be an important part of facilitating these reforms.
Thank you. Now, I heard you before talk about too much accountability or monitoring overload. And so those are interesting concepts. And so I'd love for you to tell us a bit about what that means and what are the negative consequences that they can cause.
Yeah. Thanks, Barbara. Actually, before I answer that question, I just wanted to underscore something Santiago said. Right. I mean, I think one really important thing to identify and build when we can is this golden triangle where it has to be in the interests of when you can get higher levels or leaders aligned with the public against lower levels that are, you know, not performing or misbehaving, that is the golden triangle where you might get reform. And I think identifying places where that exists or building it by informing the public, informing the top, building that alliance is really the sweet spot. So yes, you know, Brenda and I had talked a little bit about you know, one of my initial reactions, I mean, maybe because I am writing a paper with some of my colleagues on pathologies of accountability. You know, as I personally think a lot, all of my time on about citizen engagement, government accountability, it is becoming increasingly clear that sometimes we pay too much attention to accountability or too much attention to the wrong way of designing accountability. And so we've started to lay out a bit of a typology, and actually the first one might simply be going back to this needing alignment between simple, clear input from citizens and simple, clear questions from governments. My husband's British, and so we talk a lot about Brexit. So, you know, the first point I would make is that it's not just the quantity of citizen engagement that matters, it's the quality of it. And it's not, and I don't mean high quality versus low quality, I mean the nature of it. So citizens find it difficult to give input on very complex issues. And moreover, in places where politics is very emotive, where those of us who are behavioral scientists might call like activating our reptilian brain, it's not totally clear that we want that quality of citizen engagement. So that's the first potential pathology of too much accountability. The next few are about the government side. So one of my co-authors works on India politics, and he was talking about this case of Uttar Pradesh where a lot of local bureaucrats failed to implement NREGA, which is the rural work employment scheme that guarantees 100 days of work to rural households. And in UP, I think the average is only 40 days of work. So it's highly under-implemented. And when you interview local bureaucrats, they say that the risk and the cost of a bad audit far outweighs the benefits of good performance and actual provision of the program, right? So here, this is very interesting. Like, accountability is leading to paralysis because the expected utilities are not right. Like, the incentives are not right. And I think actually more broadly speaking, from the point of view of a frontline service provider or bureaucrat, they don't get rewarded for good performance, right? So that, I think, is a really important thing that we don't think enough about. A second pathology would be, I'm sure as all of you have seen, the substitution of more visible corruption for less visible corruption, right? So you shine a stronger light and it just gets submerged. Monitoring overload is something that is just, that happens with bureaucracy. But so this is when the resources for performance get sucked into the resources for monitoring, right? So doctors in the United States are constantly complaining about the additional paperwork because they have to report on what they're doing instead of actually doctoring. But I think where this, the lesson here is that as we apply or institute more accountability systems, that helps shrink the variance in performance, but we also have to be mindful it might also lower the mean, right? So, and it might be worth it. Like we do want to shrink the variance in performance. But just to be aware. So that's on the government. Oh, one last one: motivational crowding. As a behavioral scientist, the more we apply extrinsic pressure, external pressure, punishment, the less that frontline service providers and grassroots street-level bureaucrats are going to be acting out of the goodness of their heart. And that there's a huge amount of research to show that that is the case. So again, something to be aware of as we apply more accountability pressure and accountability institutions. Now, on the citizen side, which is actually where most of my research is on, two important pathologies of accountability initiatives and anti-corruption initiatives. One is that when there are anti-corruption campaigns and it does not lead to better government performance, what we often see is citizen disillusionment and exit. So ironically, as we provide more open government, more transparency, more information about corruption, citizens get really discouraged and they are less likely to engage because they lose efficacy. They think, what's the point of, it's not rational for them to engage. They're being told, your government is not responsive to you. So the rational thing is not to participate. Or you get the radical flip side, which is anti-system populism. The more you tell people you should not trust your politicians, you should not trust your institutions, then you get engagement, but engagement along the lines of eroding those institutions.
Thank you. Does any of that resonate, or do you have any experiences related to what Lily has just said?
The point about information overload that Lily was making, I think, is important. By now, there's a huge amount of work being done on generating information in portals, right? Taking advantage of technology. And people claim, everything's transparent. You can look it up in the website, and there's a huge amount of information. And you enter the website, and you need a PhD in Excel to be able to go through the website and find what. But everything's transparent. And at the end of the day, the number of people who can cruise through that, extract information, and act on that information is very, very few. So we need to find other tools to actually be able to motivate people and to engage people if we want that engagement to be sort of continuous. The traditional model that we have of governments accountable, which is that the legislative makes the executive accountable, doesn't really work well almost anywhere, right? Particularly if the legislative and the executive are from the same party, and there are all sorts of agreements. So the potential for having various organizations of civil society participating in the debate can be very important, but these organizations of civil society must be able to get this information, act on this information, and again be able to engage with citizens so that citizens do something with it. And that might sometimes happen when there's a very acute issue, a big issue that everybody is very concerned about and debating about. Pension reform in Brazil, you know, you get on the taxi and the taxi driver will tell you about, you know, whether pension reform is well designed or not well designed. But not every issue is pension reform. So, you know, if you think about, okay, so what is the next nutrition program that we're going to do in the rules? People don't care. So how do you get people to actually participate, and how do you get instances that can push the government to make the right decision? And again, go back to my early intervention, to use the available evidence from previous impact evaluations and from previous work before they go ahead and they waste, you know, use I don't know how many $1 million in some nutrition program in the north of Brazil. That I don't know how we do.
I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in a few minutes, and I will be doing that through your cellular device, so you can start to get out your cell phones or iPads or mobile devices. But I know there are a lot of evaluators in the room, and so I can't have you here and not ask you this question, because when you think about Progressa Oportunidades, it has been a model for a lot. So it's been evaluated a lot, and there's been a lot of other governments that have used it because of the proven results. But my question for you is, when you were designing the program, how did you know it was going to work, or what evidence did you use?
So the honest truth?
Yeah, tell us the truth.
We didn't know. We didn't know, because it was the first program of the kind that was there. We were very fortunate that the President of Mexico at that time was President Cedillo, which was an academic, you know, sort of with a strong academic formation. And he would ask me, you know, all the time, so how do you know that this is going to work? And I said, I don't know. He says, where has it been done before? Well, not really, you know, nowhere. So what we decided to do was to make evaluation part of the design of the program, and it was an honest-to-God effort by saying, look, we don't really know what's going to happen. We think on the basis of theory that this will happen. We're not 100% sure. And so we're going to inbuild evaluation as part of the program design. And then, and this is President Cedillo's, you know, to his credit, we agreed that the evaluation was going to be done by people external to the government. And when we wrote the contract for them, it was written such that they will not show us the result before they made them public. So that it was whatever came out.
Right.
And fortunately, things came out well, and that made it very credible. And the credibility of that evaluation is what contributed for the program to continue through various other situations in the future. Let me add a 30-second on that, because there's an update on the program. As Brenda was saying, this is a program that has been made, perhaps some of you have heard about it, but it's been very strongly evaluated. I count more than 100 papers, academic papers published in academic journals on various dimensions in impact on health, education, nutrition, use of time, you know, savings, a whole bunch of dimensions. By and large, the evidence is positive. You know, not perfect, but the evidence is positive. And this has helped the program to sustain for 20 years. What is really interesting, sad, but interesting from an analytical point of view, is that we just had a change of government in Mexico, and the new government decided to discontinue the program, despite the fact that we have 20 years of evidence that says that this works, and that this is producing results. And this is a very good example, a sad one, but a very good one, of the inability of communicating the results of evaluation to a set of people who perhaps don't think it's credible or look at the world through different lenses, and the fragility of having the results of the evaluation shared only within a small development community, as opposed to being part of the social capital of the country, so to speak. If these results were broadly known, the government could have not stopped the program. But these results were known by 50 people at the IDB, 50 people at the World Bank, 20 people at the IMF, 200 people at the universities, and 300 other people at the development community. And we all talked about, and it was said it was great, but 99% of the population of Mexico had no sense of these results. And this is the challenge where I say, we need to go one step further to bring all this evaluation and all these results in a language that people can actually assimilate and then act on.
Thank you. And this is something I champion too as the manager for knowledge and communications in IEG. I really care that we make what we know accessible to many people who can use it. And so one of the things I want to ask you, Lily, is I know the Governance Lab generates lots of innovations and evidence, but what do you do to make sure that learning and uptake happens from what you generate?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly, one of the things that we're turning to. I mean, just to underscore what Santiago is saying, we have this room full of researchers and evaluators, but very few translators. And I don't mean like, translation from English to French. I mean like people who are taking evidence, because we're very poorly equipped to do that. Like we kind of think, we made this evidence, it's rational, like people should just learn it, right? But actually, and if there's a silver lining to, the attention to misinformation and social media, et cetera, it is this, that it really matters how that information is translated and put into a narrative. And so one of the things that we're doing at GovLab is working with a narratives lab, another group, to craft those narratives for civil society organizations, because it's not enough just to have the evidence. It should be evidence-based. Advocacy should be evidence-based, just like policymaking should be evidence-based. But there is an important element of designing a narrative with the user in mind. And so whether the users are government decision makers, and though they, absolutely sometimes the users should be the government decision makers, but there should be user-centered design based on that, or market research based on that. And when the user is supposed to be the public, similarly, there should be narratives that employ evidence that are designed with the user's interests and needs in mind. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, follow up with you on that. I'm very interested in that. So now it's the audience's turn. And again, we're not doing mics running around the room. You're submitting your questions through Polev. So open up your device and go to www.polev.com/IEG now. There is Wi-Fi in the room. Javier? Oh, so look in your packet and the Wi-Fi password is in your packet. So I'll wait a few minutes so that you can get up to speed.
You don't allow us to speak.
Right. There's going to be lots of opportunities to speak, but not right now. There's the lunch break. There's the happy hour. No, I'm kidding. So again, if you see a question you want to have from the monitor, just shout out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll pick them.
I'll let Levy. Oh, no, go ahead. I'll take the first one.
Yeah, okay. So Santiago is going to answer, can you speak to the role of multilaterals in supporting citizens in the context of closing civic space around the globe? So
this is a really interesting and relevant question. And I think there's a deep governance issue here. When I was at the Inter-American Development Bank, I spent 10 years there. The question is, who is the client of the Inter-American Development Bank? Mexico or the Mexican government? Who is the client of the World Bank? The Mexican government or Mexico? And they're two very different things. Because if the World Bank or the IDB, or for that matter, the Asian Development Bank, begins to engage systematically with civil society organizations, NGOs and all that, perhaps fund them through, not alone, but technical cooperation and support. And some of these organizations are critical of the government. The finance ministry is not going to be very happy. And the finance ministry might say, look, you work for us. So who does the World Bank work for? for the government or for the, and this is an unsolved issue, and there's kind of a fuzzy gray area in the middle in which, yes, the multilaterals are trying to engage more with civil society. I think this is positive. But there's some unwritten limits that are out there. And I think that eventually the governance has to change a little bit for the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and in general multilateral development banks to continue responsibly engaging with civil society without participating in local politics, so to speak. There's a border there that's kind of difficult to establish, even though in some cases the finance ministry is not too happy about the way that's being done, without pushing things over the limit. And that's an area in which I think we're all groping to find the right equilibrium, and I think it's going to be evolving. But to the extent that the governance and the mandates of the MDBs coming from their boards to engage more with civil society in a more systematic way, they'll need some guidelines, will actually, despite the fact that it might cause some unease at times in finance ministries, I think on the whole, it'll be positive.
It's tricky balance, yeah. So there was a question earlier that I thought, I know, there's lots of questions coming in, this is great. Did you see, there was a question about gender and ethnicity and social identity and how that affects citizen engagement outcomes. Do you have any evidence on that?
This is a really interesting system. So people are like bubbling over.
Lots of interest,
I'm not
yes.
sure that we'll be able to.
No, you don't have to. That's my job. I'll ask you questions.
There is a question that says, how does gender, income, ethnicity, and other social identities affect citizen engagement outcomes? And so here there are two things to consider, based on the research. One is when they provide resources for negative resources, and sometimes they are they enable mobilization, right? So identity can work in a couple of ways, right? You could be, in places where women, being a woman means that you are less able to acquire the resources for participation, public speaking, or mobilizing other people, or whether you have the connections or security from retribution when you say.
Oh, Levy, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry about that. I'm used to
we have people
I'm used to
online.
lecturing.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's you want to evaluate it as a resource. There can be interesting intersectionalities. So I have a former student, who has pointed out that lower caste women in India, because they're forced to go outside of the village and work, they actually, interestingly, make more connections, and so they actually have more resources for political participation than higher caste women. So, thinking about how that works as a resource. The other way is as a mobilization tool. So when you have very strong identity groups, on the one hand, that might increase polarization, but on the other hand, that enables collective action. So it can work both ways.
That's interesting. There was a question about CSOs versus citizens. And we've talked a lot about citizens, but where do CSOs fit into this triangle?
What is CSO?
Civil society organizations.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Oh, I did it. I'm sorry.
The more the merrier, right? What you want, that's my view. What you want is that society has a very broad spectrum of participants with legitimate different views, which is fine, which can then participate in a policy debate. Because the notion that we elect a president, we elect a Congress, we sit back and relax, and the Congress and the president will interact with each other and they will take care of policy in the best interest of all of us and everything will be nice and dandy, is just not there. So we know that both the president or the executive power and Congress continuously need to be pushed in different directions. So civil society organizations, if they're organized, if they're credible, if they make use of some of the evidence that is put together by academics or by the MDBs, they can then influence the debate in a constructive way. And Alison was mentioning just at the beginning of the opening of the session, about the role of technology. One of the great things now is that with social media, a lot of people can participate in many of these policy debates, and there's a lot of exchange of information. The question is, how do we then construct it and orderly in a way that it can be aggregated and reflected in policy making? And I think I can think of CSOs as aggregators of all this information, and then being able to then engage with relevant authorities, being the president or Congress.
Very good. So there's two questions that relate to each other, but I wonder if you can speak on them together. And one is, so sarcastically, do evaluators have to be journalists? Right. So the question is, you know, all of this discussion of evidence dissemination, who's doing it? And then a related question being, if there are people like senior officials who only want to use evidence that confirms what they already believe, then how do you communicate the evidence to change their mind? So you can pick one or the other or both.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one is related a little bit to what Santiago is saying, that there have to be partnerships, and you know, so one partnership might actually be between evaluators and civil society organizations, where civil society organizations are curating the information. They are the translators, they're the infomediaries, and they are, but I think that we have to make it an explicit initiative to cultivate the role of civil society organizations in doing that. But that doesn't relieve us of the need and responsibility for researchers to communicate what we do better, even to civil society organizations or those who are translating and curating. So, so I think that, but I think partnerships and also just making that an explicit objective for additional support, both technical and financial support, is going to be a really important one. Otherwise, all that evidence does go wasted. You know, a lot of evidence does go wasted. In terms of, what was the second part of the question? Like a political... Like
changing their minds. What do you do if someone is only looking for evidence to confirm what they already believe? What can you do to change their minds?
I mean, I think that their evidence itself can be useful when it is independent. And so I think the trick, like, so the first thing might be to say, independent evidence itself is a political resource, right? So being able to say that this was objective, that there was no political stake in the production of this research and evidence, that can be itself a political resource. And both civil society organizations who do evidence-based advocacy, by using evidence that is generated from independent researchers, they are able to use that at the bargaining table with politicians in their countries. I think similarly, government reformers can often use it as a political resource by saying, this is objective. There is no like political interest in the production of this evidence. But, you know, I mean, I think, I had another point, but I'm losing it. Yeah, so.
No, that's a good one, and it relates to a question. If you don't have technology and you want to write a question on a card, you can just raise your hand and we'll bring you a card. And I'm trying to read the handwriting on this one, but it's something about political polarization as the root cause, sort of one-issue voters, and asymmetrical information between the government and the citizens. So the government believes one thing and the citizens believe another. Have you ever, do you have any stories around that, and what can we do around political polarization? Santiago.
There are many instances in which the government believes one thing and the citizens at large believe a different thing, and it's a very difficult problem. Think about macroeconomic policy. The government says, look, you know, we need to bring the budget in balance, and for that it's inevitable that we have to do some budget cuts. And 90% of the population out there is something that they don't believe. What 90% of the population will say, no. They're stealing the money, and if they stop stealing the money, they don't have to cut any budget. And you come back and you say, look, I know they're stealing the money, but even if they stole half of it, the orders of magnitude of what needs to be done there's no comparability. Of course we want to stop them stealing the money and stop corruption, but even if we were 100% successful, it's still not good enough. We need to do a budget. This is a problem in Latin America that has been occurring. It's being lived as we speak right now in Argentina. And it's a problem of asymmetric information because the government is unable to communicate credibly to the population what the numbers are and what the choices are. And at the end of the day, the government prevails only because, by trick, by power, but it does not prevail because the citizens are convinced of what it's being doing is the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this conflict is systemic, and it appears again and again, and it hasn't been really solved. And it's, in the end, a failure of communication on the part of the government.
Mm. One of the things we do in IEG, and a lot of MDBs do, is we invest in building monitoring and evaluation capacity in client countries, because we have this theory that the better able governments are to generate their own evidence and use evidence, then the better decisions they'll be able to make. Do you have any evidence on that, or do you also work on M&E capacity building?
This I don't know. I'm better on the citizen civil society side. Yeah, but I am seeing a bunch of questions and comments that are popping up around the role of political parties, the increasing polarization. How do you get evidence and factual information to matter in situations like that? I think that's a little bit of what was behind the one issue, one voter, one issue voters, single issue voters. So I guess, I guess what I would say is, building on Santiago's comments, it's, number one, we do need to rebuild or build new organizations that dispense that are trusted sources of information. I mean, I think that is one of the things that globally we need to have an initiative on, because I think that's right. Political parties are increasingly not trusted, and nor are they reliable. The media, I mean, normal academia, these are all considered interest groups in a lot of places. They are not considered purveyors of factual information or good research. They're interest groups. And so we need to think sort of out of the box about how to build new trusted sources of information. And I don't actually have a sense of what that necessarily would be. I do have an intuition that civil society organizations might actually be part of the answer there. So that's one thing. I mean, the single issue voter is a really interesting question, because that just reminds me that a lot of our research and evaluations are based on Western theories of democratic participation and representation that assume that voters want to be educated, and they want to deliberate, and a lot of those assumptions are not empirically correct. So being aware that voters they engage in blind retrospection. They do not naturally seek to educate themselves. They don't even naturally want to take political action. And moreover, in a lot of the contexts in which we function, there's a lot of fear and risk that go along with citizen engagement that we don't fully take into account when we simply apply, principal agent models or Western theories of democratic representation to an intervention that incorporates citizen engagement.
So given that, what else should we do? What should we do differently?
I think we should be paying more attention to the conditions under which there is fear and risk, mitigating that fear and risk, understanding what kinds of, so political connections is a really interesting example, right? So we typically think of political connections as a bad thing, like it encourages corruption and rent seeking and clientelism. But in a lot of places, political connections are a useful resource for people to participate, because they are insulated against retribution to some extent, and so they feel safer. And we tend not to, number one, design interventions that take that into account, and number two, design research that investigates that.
Interesting. See anything you want, or you want me to pull one for you?
Like 20 went by. I want to thank everybody.
There's really a lot. So if you're saying, why isn't she asking my question? Because there's 47 questions. Gabby, can you go back up a little bit?
Oh, I see.
So this is interesting to me, and maybe you guys don't have an opinion on it, but it's got a real assumption in there. The question is, how do you balance rigor of analysis with clear communication to the public? So it's implying that those two things have a tension. Do you see a tension there?
There is a tension. There is a tension in the following sense. it's difficult to communicate nuance. People like clears, black, white, yes, no. Okay, so this is what we do, or this is what we don't. Who's right? And say, no, it's not so easy. It's a little bit nuanced. Under some conditions, this, and under some. Communicating nuance is extremely difficult. And I do see a tension there. And Lily's call for translators, people to be able to capture this, and then for people to understand that the issue that is being discussed is complex, and there are pros and cons, and that things need to be balanced. I think we're years from there. We're not there yet. But yes, it is a conflict.
I agree. Yeah, I can't, but she can go back up. Can you go to some of the older ones?
Oh, building trust and credibility. I mean, I think this goes back to there's an increasing amount of research that shows the way to build trust and credibility is to say something against your political interests. So, I have this, it's what I call disruptive interlocutors. It's when, in the United States context, when a Republican says something that supports a Democratic policy position, that is a trusted source of information. And so the more that you can remove information from political interests, the more trusted it will be. And that would be how to, I went to this very I'm part of this group on misinformation, and I heard one of the directors of the BBC speak, and she was saying that, number one, the BBC remains a very trusted institution in the UK for two reasons. This is her thinking. Number one is because they provide entertainment, and that is also, I think, an underestimated, a strength of a trusted institution. It's pleasurable and entertaining to engage with it. So that's number one. But number two, they have that principle, I forget what they call it, but they give equal weight to all voices. And so, and I know that's hotly debated, but I think that there is a decision to be made between the trade-off of trust, widespread trust, and the possible costs of giving weight to voices that you might not disagree with.
Okay. You wanted to say something?
No, I want to tell an anecdote about nuance.
Okay.
So when I was in the finance ministry, there was a change from the sales tax to the value-added tax. So the sales tax was 4%, and then we wanted to change it to a value-added tax of 10%. And the sales tax, of course, remember, it works along the chain. So the intermediate input pays 4%, and then the next good pays 4%, and then the next 4%, and it builds up into the price of the good, whereas the value-added tax is only 10% on the actual value added. So we designed a communication campaign to explain to the public why it was going to be much better to go from the sales tax of 4% to the value-added tax of 10%. And there were in the television these ads about the box paid intermediate inputs, and then it would come into this. And the communicators told us, look, forget it. You're never going to be able to explain to people that 10 is less than 4.
Nuance. Very nice. That's a great anecdote. It almost feels like the right place to end. We only have a few more minutes before I have to let everyone go to break. So instead of asking yet another question, let me just turn to each of you and say, is there one more thing that you want to say on this topic before we close this session? This has been a great discussion. I want to give you the opportunity to say one last thought.
So I want to close with my earlier statement. The production function of research, evidence, policy making needs to be enhanced. Research, evidence, policy making, communication, translation, communication to a much broader set of people than the set of people with whom we're communicating. It doesn't mean that it was wrong before, it just means that we need to conquer a space that we haven't entered. And I think that's, if I think about the 10 years forward, I think that's the space that we need to conquer.
Thank you.
I think similarly, I would go back to my original comment about investing more effort in building houses and not just making bricks. I am seeing a number of comments along those lines that, you know, we do these very atomistic evaluations, especially when they're experimental, and we need to understand much more about the conditions under which the findings in any single study are likely to hold in another context. And we're becoming increasingly able to do that. Systematic reviews are one way, like paying more attention to what researchers would call heterogeneous treatment effects, not just at the individual level, but at the community and country level. But also just investing more effort and providing incentives for these, you know, broad reviews that are theoretically structured, because we don't have a lot of incentives to do that. Absolutely, for the researchers, the incentive is to like produce a good evaluation or a single good study, and so for those who can provide those incentives, like that needs to be more of an objective.